So I want to talk about a very controversial subject today, the subject of ego death. And we chose the title Ego Death, not because I really understand what it is, because I don't think very many people do, but because it was very provocative. So this is a very controversial question about enlightenment, what happens to the ego, and does the ego die or not? And if it does, what does it really mean? So this is something I've been thinking about for a good 35 years. So I know a little bit about it and I have a lot of experience in this area, but it's very confusing. It remains to be a confusing question because so many so-called experts, including me, seem to disagree with each other about fundamentals. So this is a very confusing area. It's a very confusing topic. It's theoretically, a lot of people seem to have it figured out, but I really question whether anybody has it figured out. I have a lot of different ideas about it. I have a lot of different thoughts, which I think are important, significant, relevant, and helpful. And I work with them myself to try to make sense out of my own experience of enlightenment, how confusing it is sometimes. And I think if you're willing to just consider some of the things I'm saying, some of the paradoxes that I will present to you, I think it'll help you to come to terms with the question that is ultimately very mysterious. Because the question of what does it mean to be, what is enlightenment, number one, and what does it mean for a human being, which is who and what we all are, to actually manifest enlightened awareness. What if enlightenment exists, if it's real, if what people like the Buddha and the Ramana Maharshi, what they were speaking about is true, what does that miraculous and mysterious state of consciousness walk like and talk like and act like? And what does it have to do with the very real day-to-day experience of each and every one of us, especially for those of us who are doing our best to take enlightenment seriously and are taking our own potential for enlightenment seriously. For those of us who are serious about it, which not very many people are, but for those of us who are serious about it, or at least believe we're serious about it, we might be deluded, of course, also. But for those of us who believe we're serious about what does it mean to be enlightened, what does it look like, what does it walk like, what does it talk like, what does it feel like? And that's always the question I've been interested in, because I was always aware that of the theory. I would read about the theory of what enlightenment looks like, acts like, walks like, and talks like, and I would want to know, well, what does this really mean about our humanity? How do we express this miraculous state of consciousness in and through the complexity of our human consciousness? And so, especially when I was a younger man, and I was still a seeker, I went to see as many supposedly enlightened teachers, masters, and gurus as I could, because I wanted to know what enlightenment looked like. Not just what it was like, what it was supposed to be like from a theoretical or abstract intellectual perspective, philosophical perspective, but I wanted to know what enlightened human beings actually look like. And it's very confusing, because the whole notion of enlightenment emerged in 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, during the mythic era. And so enlightenment for many people means a state of that which is perfect, a state of perfection, a state of human perfection. And human perfection in the enlightenment context usually means that the separate self sense, the unique separate self sense, has been utterly obliterated. And I'm just speaking metaphorically, I'm not speaking literally. It's what we imagine in the mythic context. That the separate ego, that the separate self sense has been utterly and radically obliterated. And what's left is a human being whose consciousness is more or less fundamentally only aware of the consciousness of cosmic unity, of what some people call God consciousness. And their separate I sense, a unique separate I sense of being a unique ego. has been utterly destroyed once and for all and forever. And so to be in the presence of such a being is to be in the presence of God, really. God appearing through the body, mind, personality of a unique human being, man or woman. But it's the God consciousness which is fundamentally what's being expressed. In the separate I sense, the separate ego sense, the personal and unique identity is gone forever. At least this is the mythic idea. And as all of us are aware of, the story that in the late 60s and 1970s, when many hippies who discovered glimpses of enlightened awareness through the taking of ingesting psychedelic substances, traveled to India and were seeking the company of true enlightened masters, and they met many of them. Many enlightened masters were brought back to America and to Europe. And this is when these mythic beliefs, these mythic ideas of the perfect state of enlightenment crashed into Western psychology and the postmodern scrutiny and deep understanding of human nature. And then everybody started to see that these enlightened masters were also shockingly human, not always in the best ways. And there's so many examples of these kinds of stories. And then many people said, well, if enlightened beings are especially expressing human imperfection and issues around ego and power and narcissism and the usual kind of weaknesses, maybe enlightenment doesn't mean anything. And maybe after all, it doesn't really exist. Maybe it's all been a myth. But that's a short story of what happened. And in spite of that, many of us kept going, didn't give up. So that's the overarching context of the story. So I think most people are interested in this topic, begrudgingly will admit that enlightenment does exist. But most people don't really know what it means. And these days, a lot of people are become very cynical about whether enlightenment is real or whether it's even attainable. So we live in a context right now, in a cultural context where I'm speaking in broad strokes. I'm making big general statements that don't apply to everybody by any stretch of the imagination. And more people now tend to be interested in psychological healing rather than enlightenment, and they're not the same thing. And I really wanted to emphasize at the beginning of this talk that psychological healing is not enlightenment. And the awakening to enlightened awareness, which is what enlightenment is all about, is not about psychological healing. Psychological healing is about the attempt to heal our childhood wounds, unresolved traumas, and things like that, which is what everybody seems to be talking about these days. But the quest for enlightenment is a search for the direct experience, the liberating experience, the liberating experience, the liberating experience of the awakening to enlightened awareness, which is a thing that exists. Enlightened awareness is a higher state of consciousness. It's what the Buddha was pointing to. It's what he was calling all of us to. It's what Ramana Maharshi was speaking about when he spoke about awakening to the self. It's what my own guru, the great H.W.L. Punja, was speaking about when he talked about awakening to the self with a capital S. So just to make a simple distinction that everybody's already aware of, clear, enlightenment is about transcending the ego and the small self. And psychological work is about healing the ego and the small self. So I want to make clear that enlightenment is about transcendence. That's not a new idea. It's about transcending the small self completely, totally, radically, and absolutely, at least for a period of time. And about experiencing a state of consciousness that is utterly unaffected and untouched by anything that the ego's ever experienced. That's why it's so liberating, because it's different territory. It's territory where there's innocence and purity and the presence of eternity and unthinkable and unimaginable positivity, the experience of which and the knowledge of which is utterly transformational. It doesn't necessarily heal the ego, but it transcends it. The ego temporarily disappears. Doesn't die forever, but in the state of transcendence, the ego is nowhere to be found. And psychological healing is about psychological healing, and it all needs to be done. We all need to be doing it if we want to be happy. But I sometimes think that too many people these days are confusing psychological work with the work of transcendence, and they're not the same thing. They're both necessary and important, but they're not identical. They're not the same thing. They're very, very different. And some people are just more interested in psychological healing. They're more interested in coming to terms with their woundedness and their unresolved traumas that are still bothering them. And that's absolutely reasonable and totally fine. And some other people, myself included, have always been more interested in transcendence than in healing. And I know I'm not supposed to say that in polite company, but it's just true. It's just they're not the same thing. And be wary or be careful when psychological healing and enlightenment are spoken about in the same breath, or when a spiritual guru says they're the same thing, they're not. Or if a psychotherapist says they're the same thing, they're not. I once asked my guru, who had a very big ego. He had an enormous ego, unbelievable. And he also had a very big enlightenment. His enlightenment was unimaginably huge, enormous, vast, incomprehensible, mysterious, overwhelming, ecstasy producing. His enlightenment so big that in his presence the whole world would disappear. One felt that one was suddenly sitting at the heart of the cosmos. The spiritual energy that was vibrating in and around his physical form, in and through his persona, was absolutely overwhelming. I haven't before, and since I've never met such a being who was so powerfully awake. It could transmit this state to other people so effortlessly, in such a way that a lot of people never recovered from meeting him. But that didn't mean he was egoless. He seemed to be egoless when he was in these dramatic higher states. But the rest of the time, his ego was in good shape, very present and active, and sometimes not so pretty. Did that mean he wasn't enlightened? Absolutely not. It did not mean he wasn't enlightened. This is the whole paradox I'm trying to bring to all of you. It didn't mean he wasn't enlightened. It meant he had issues, like so many of us do. So he had big issues. He was a very powerful man, for better and for worse. But his awakening to enlightened awareness was undoubtable. It was impossible to doubt or impossible to question, because when he was vibrating, it was like sitting in front of God. Time and space seemed to warp around him. They did. And the day I met him, which is March 25th, 1986, is the day my life changed forever. Simply because I met him and experienced his grace, sat in front of him. And as a result of that meeting, I had an experience of awakening after about 10 minutes. So I asked him during my early weeks with him, I said, with enlightenment, I said, does the ego die? And he said, no, the ego doesn't die, but it becomes sattvic. Sattvic means peaceful. He said, so the effect of enlightened awareness is that the ego becomes pacified. So it doesn't die, but it becomes pacified. So one of the points I wanted to make in this talk was that in the therapeutic context, we want to understand why we're so. We want to come to an understanding of why we're suffering. What are the issues or the events that happened in our past that created very negative impressions in our nervous systems and in our souls. And as long as they remain unresolved, they're going to continue to cause us trouble and cause us to suffer in the present moment. With the awakening to enlightened awareness, what happens is that the awakening to higher consciousness reveals what's instantly recognized to be a much deeper dimension of reality. One experiences what seems like a deeper truth, not only about oneself and one's history, but about life itself, about existence. And the discovery of this deeper truth about reality, about life and existence, is so unthinkably positive, that it at least temporarily displaces our obsession with our own suffering, and our obsession with our own misery, and our obsession with our own pain. And so once this happens, we want to see, well, what do I need to do to remain conscious of this deeper truth? That becomes what spiritual practice is all about. What is it that we need to do? What is it that I need to do in order to remain conscious of this deeper truth? Because if I'm conscious of this deeper truth, my obsession with my own ego's pain and suffering and misery and grief will be displaced. And usually the intensity of that state of consciousness will continue to displace our experience of pain and suffering and misery and grief. Now, of course, a lot of people say, especially psychotherapists say, that those individuals who are obsessed with higher states of consciousness are using their experiences of these higher states to spiritually bypass or to avoid their own shadows, their own unresolved issues. And if that's true, if that's true, and often it is true, then that would mean that our spiritual part of a fundamental part of our spiritual practice would have to be facing the difficult truths about ourselves that we would tend to like to avoid. And just in case anybody's wondering about my approach to all this in my own teaching work of evolutionary enlightenment, I have 5 fundamental principles that I work with, and the first is cultivating the unconditional desire for liberation first and foremost as a first principle in one's relationship to existence and to life itself. I want to be free more than anything else first and foremost. More than I want to be rich, more than I want to be famous, more than I want to be anything. I want to be free. I want to know what the Buddha knew. But the second says, if you want to be free, if you truly want to be free, you have to learn to take responsibility from all of your karma, past, present, and even future. Because if you're anybody who's aspiring to become a bodhisattva also has to take responsibility for what has yet to happen, for the future. So the second principle of the teaching tells us if we want to be free, we have to be willing to take unconditional, absolute, and radical responsibility for our karma coming from our past, present, and also the future. And the third principle that I teach says, if we want to take responsibility for karma, past, present, and future, how are we going to do it? The only way to do it's going to be by facing everything and avoiding nothing. And that is not an easy form of spiritual practice to do. It says, if you want to be free more than anything else, you have to face everything and avoid nothing. We have to learn how to face everything and avoid nothing. And speaking about it is one thing, doing it is another. It's very difficult because the ego, your ego, my ego, the ego, tends to have a great resistance and reluctance to face everything and avoid nothing, especially issues about ourselves that make us feel uncomfortable or ill at ease, that don't make us feel so good about ourselves. So facing everything and avoiding nothing requires a lot of humility and a depth of resolve for purification at the level of the soul. It's not for the faint of heart. So one thing to understand that in terms of in terms of this distinction I'm making in this talk between the enlightenment perspective and the therapeutic perspective, is that when we're trying to heal the ego, when we're trying to heal it in a psychological context, if you're working with a good therapist, you won't demonize it. You won't demonize the ego. That'll just make the division or the split in the self even deeper. Because, of course, the goal in the therapeutic context is for the wounded self that's become divided against itself to become healed, to become whole, to reunify with itself, and resolve in the attempt to resolve the trauma, resolve the split. But I'm losing track of my direction here. Just give me a second. Yes, but what happens? What I wanted to say is that this is something that not a lot of people know about, is that from the perspective of enlightened awareness, when you awaken to enlightened awareness within yourself, when you awaken to enlightened awareness within yourself, and you start seeing, perceiving reality through a different lens, the lens of enlightened awareness itself, you start to find the presence of the ego or separate self sense, especially in individuals that are particularly and uniquely identified with the separate self sense, and individuals who have particularly narcissistic tendencies. From the perspective of the awakening to enlightened awareness, seen through the lens of enlightened awareness, the ego is seen as an obstruction. I remember when I'm 67 now, so I started experimenting with psychedelic drugs when I was far too young. When I was about 16, I took a very powerful dose of LSD, and I remember a friend of mine had a very big ego. He was quite a narcissistic character, and me and a bunch of my friends were in the country, and we took a particularly large dose of this powerful psychedelic drug. And I remember when my friend walked in, I'm sure many of you have had this kind of experience. His ego was so ugly, and I suddenly saw it through the lens of this kind of psychedelic state. I saw his ego as this monstrosity, as this ugly creature or appendage. It was particularly shocking and particularly painful. Of course, this was the effect of the psychedelic substance, of course, animated this particular reactivity in me. But when we awaken to enlightened awareness, the ego is felt to be an obstacle. It's suddenly seen as not our friend. So it's not because the enlightened awareness has its own self sense. When you awaken to enlightened awareness, you awaken to a different part of your own self. And a different part of your own self has particular sensibilities, preferences, likes and dislikes. And so when you awaken to enlightened awareness in similar ways as to how reality gets seen from the perspective of being in a trance state activated by psychedelic substances, you can become more sensitive to particular issues that ordinarily would not be bothersome. So I just wanted to make this point that while in a therapeutic context, we want to befriend the ego and don't want to alienate it, so we can help to serve its reunification with itself, heal the wounds. When we see the ego from a deeply awakened state of enlightened awareness, we see the problem that it is, because it wants to remain separate. It stands against cosmic unity. Unknowingly, it can't help it. It's not deliberate or it's not deliberate or intentional. It's just that its entire position in relationship to existence and to life itself is to stand apart and to be separate. It doesn't want to die, to drown in love. It does not want to disappear into absolute or cosmic unity. So when we awaken to enlightened awareness, we discover that the ego can be very problematic for us, especially if we also are very interested in enlightenment. Ironically, the more interested in enlightenment you are, the more serious you are about it, the more problematic the ego can become. Because even though the ego doesn't die, at least in my experience, and most of the others I've observed, the ego has to somehow, in some mysterious way, has to be experientially convinced, or you, whoever you are, have to be experientially convinced about that which is higher and more real, in such a way that your ego will willingly step aside and become second fiddle. The ego always wants to be the star of its own movie. And like I've been saying for many years, our narcissism, which is arrogant self-importance, undeserved, unearned, arrogant self-importance. And for our postmodern conditioned narcissism, which is the unearned superiority, it means I want to be able to stand out and be seen as being separate from the others, the world, and the whole universe. It's a desire to stand out and away from the whole or the others or the world. I want you to see me. I don't want to disappear. I don't want to die into the infinite, that which is eternal. I want you to see me. And the ego doesn't want to let go of its own uniqueness, its own specialness, its own separateness. And it's a contrary position to the very inner momentum of enlightened awareness itself. Because enlightened awareness is the feeling or the sense, the momentum of unity, which is the ultimate nature of reality, the ultimate nature of the cosmos. The ultimate truth about the cosmos is the principal truth about that Vedanta speaks so loudly about. Vedanta tells us that the ultimate truth about the nature of reality is that there's only one and not two. And I am, and you all are that one without a second. I am that. And the the ego says, no, I'm not. No, I'm not, and no, I won't. So then, of course, if this is the situation, then of course you need a spiritual teacher or a spiritual master, someone who's actually crossed this Rubicon, who can help you to deal with these conflicting motives in your own self. The part of you that wants to be unconditionally free and liberated, wants to die in love and cosmic unity, once and for all and forever, eternally for eternity, never to return again. And your ego's and the ego's refusal to let go, to relinquish its own power. So for the enlightenment, for the awakening to enlightened awareness to become stable, in other words, a lot of people find it easy, given the right circumstances, to awaken briefly and temporarily. But usually the awakening to enlightened awareness is a brief flight from the torment and the tyranny of the ego story. Most people fall back again very quickly into the ego's world, wondering where did it all go. So for the enlightenment to be able to stick, and for one's spiritual self-confidence to be able to stick, for the spiritual self-confidence to be able to become strong, the ego has to be, it's very simple really, but it's very difficult. The ego has to be willing to become second fiddle. Not first fiddle, not star of the movie anymore. You can be here if you want, but you've got to become number two, second best, of second importance. And that you're no longer, your importance is no longer primary. It needs to become secondary. And the ego, most people at the level of ego would rather die than give up being the most special one in the whole universe. Because the ego thrives on being special. Can you see how special I am? I'm either special because I'm more talented, more intelligent, more beautiful, because I'm more traumatized, more screwed up, and I suffer more than you. The ego doesn't really care how it can be seen as special. It'll do anything to hold on to the position of being seen as special, even if it means it's a result of pain and suffering. It's ironic and tragic. So the big challenge is you, whoever you are. This is true for all of us. If we want to be able to awaken to enlightened awareness in such a way that it will become relatively stable, is that we have to be willing to die. Our ego has to be willing to relinquish its irrational need to be number one within the story of your own life. So if the ego death is real, and I can see this in people when you can tell if you meet a true seeker or someone who's a true finder. In most true finders, there's a softness in their persona, in their personality, in the way the personality expresses itself is a softness and a kindness that reflects that they've let go significantly at the deepest level of their being. A big letting go has happened. It doesn't mean it's an unconditional, absolute letting go of the ego. It doesn't mean they're fully enlightened for eternity, whatever that means. But it means their soul. It means they've allowed their soul to become wounded by the love of God, so to speak, the love of the infinite, the love of the absolute. They've allowed that which is primary and absolute to take the first place, and in that they have humbled themselves before God in an essential or fundamental, irreducible way. And this doesn't mean that the ego's gone forever. It doesn't mean it's left the room. But it means that you can feel the humility in a true seeker. This is a certain kind of arrogance that they have seemed to have transcended, at least in a significant way. And that's because there's been a deep measure of surrender to this higher principle. And of course, once that surrender has happened, once it's taken place, once a decision has been made, once that letting go has happened, doesn't mean one has reached the yonder shore, never to return again, or anything like that. But it means now one's spiritual practice is working on letting go more and more and more and more and more. but at least one now is living in the momentum of transcendence. And it means that one's pride and arrogance has been punctured, not ultimately defeated, but punctured. It means it's been wounded in a good way, spiritually wounded in a very positive way. And to do the kind of work that I'm doing, that wounding or that puncturing of the small self, and it's willing to, and the willingness in that context to take second, for the ego to take second place, willingly, happily, joyously, is essential for spiritual work even to be able to begin, spiritual work to be able to begin in earnest. Because until that's happened, all the spiritual work is just happening on the level of the intellect or the level of kind of performance. Real spiritual practice only happens once the ego has been punctured in a serious way and one has stopped resisting the love of God. Often I think when I think about this question of about ego death and what does it mean, what does it look like, I often think about my own guru, who was, as I described him, very powerfully awake, powerfully enlightened. And he also had a very strong sense of an ego, a very strong self-sense. He was a powerful man. And the only way I can metaphorically describe to you what that looks like is that if you imagine the ego as this big shield, for lack of a better word, or this frontal shield. And imagine if as a result of a powerful awakening, a huge hole had been made in the shield. And through this hole, the light of the love of God, the love of the absolute, the immensity and the inconceivable glory and goodness of higher consciousness, the transcendental radiance, will be shining through that huge hole. The shield is still there, which is a metaphor for the frontal self of the ego personality. But it's been punctured, it's been wounded. And in people who have whose awakening is profound and enormous and powerful and transformative, it means that there's a huge hole in their psyche. And through that hole, the light of God, the light of the absolute, the light of enlightened awareness shines through. So the light and the radiance of God consciousness shines through their egos. There's a couple of other things I wanted to say, I wanted to add to this picture, is that there's many different ways to describe the ego, and many different spiritual teachers and spiritual gurus and psychotherapists and innovators of all kinds have their own theories about what these cell structures look like and how they work. So I have a very simple model, which is just a simple model. The map is not the territory. So so I want to make clear the map is not the territory. So what I'm saying, what I'm about to describe to you about the ego is just one helpful way to think about it, but it's not absolutely real. It's just you can use it as a tool to help you understand something that's very difficult to understand. But the ego is the organizing principle in the psyche. So we want the organizing principle in the psyche to be in good shape, because if the organizing principle in the psyche is in bad shape, you are going to be a mess. It means yourself will be broken into many different pieces, and this is not a state or a position or a state of consciousness or relation to reality that any of us want to be subject to. That's a state of madness. So the ego is a self-organizing principle in the psyche. We want the ego to be in good shape. We want the ego to be healthy and strong. So what I call positive ego is when we have a positive relationship to our unique self-identity. When we believe that we are a good a good person, at the level of the soul, we believe that we are inherently good, which means we are lovable, we're worth loving, we are worthy of love, we're worthy of respect, worthy of the kindness and generosity of others. We believe in our own inherent decency and goodness. And we also believe in our own worthiness. Very important, we believe in our own worthiness, which means we have a measure of self-confidence, because we believe in ourselves at the level of self. It's a positive ego. And a lot of psychological work and also a lot of spiritual work, to be honest, is really about cultivating a positive ego. Sometimes we have to do a lot of psychological work and also a lot of spiritual work to get to the point where we can honestly say we respect ourselves, where we love ourselves, small self, love ourselves, respect ourselves, and believe in our own worthiness. So the negative ego is the place of our woundedness, the place of unresolved trauma, of fear and anger, resentment, rage, and so much pain. Now, if we create bad karma, and everybody does to some degree or other, it's usually because of the ways we have been wounded and traumatized and suffered at the hands of others. So the negative ego, which is the result of our woundedness, is usually the cause of all of our self-destructive behavior. And as I was just saying, a lot of psychological work and a lot of spiritual work, in the end, is about healing these wounds so that we can become self-respecting, powerfully kind, spiritually inspired, trustworthy. It's an important one, trustworthy, deeply trustworthy, very deeply trustworthy friends to ourselves and to other people. Too many of us aren't really trustworthy in the end. People who aren't trustworthy will always end up betraying themselves and betraying you. That's a result. And they do that because they can't seem to help themselves not do it. So that's the negative ego. And the negative ego needs work, and all of us, it needs work. It needs whatever work it needs to heal. Now, as I said earlier in the call, in the psychological context, that healing usually comes as a result of coming to an understanding an experiential and emotional experiential and also intellectual understanding of what happened, what the causes were to the problem. But the spiritual healing, as far as I understand it and I experience it, is very different, as I already explained, is because we've discovered something that is higher and deeper and more real, and more substantial than any psychological experience, positive and negative, could ever be. And in that context, it is our direct cognizance of that which is higher and more deeply real that frees us more and more from the negative tendencies and negative conditioning that come from the negative ego. And the way I approach this, it's my belief, it's my conviction, it's part of my philosophy, my teaching philosophy, is that I believe that the more we wake up, the more sincerely we wake up, the more we have the courage to be authentic and transparent, and the more we have the courage to be authentic and transparent, and the more inspired by higher states of consciousness, by the God consciousness, to keep our dignity, because God consciousness or higher consciousness or transcendental awareness and awakening to non-duality, if it's the real thing, will compel us to be dignified, to do the right thing. Because inherent in the spiritual awakening is the discovery of the presence of a moral imperative, which would compel us, if we have the heart to hear it, to do a little better, to make a little bit more effort, to care a little bit more, not to fall apart, but to be a little bit more anti-fragile, a little bit more strong. So we can fight the good fight. That's what we're all, I believe. I believe that's what we're all here for. After all, we've got to be here for a reason. I don't think life is a random accident, and I don't think I'm a random accident. I don't think you're a random accident. I think we're all here for a very good reason. But if we're here for a good reason, and from the perspective of God consciousness, that reason seems to be a reflection of the energy and intelligence that created the universe, in and through the body, mind, personality that God gave all of us. So I think we all, when we awaken deeply enough, we'll feel an obligation to become a reflection of our own highest potential. Not just for our own sake, but for everyone else's sake. Because when you awaken deeply enough, you keep on realizing there's a larger purpose to this whole process that we're in the midst of. But the human experience is not just an ego trip. As many people seem from their behavior, we seem to think that it is. The human experience is not, ladies and gentlemen, just an ego trip. It's a cosmic event that's unfolding through us, that's full of challenges, full of paradoxes and difficult contradictions, and full of pain and suffering. But if you awaken deeply enough, you'll see there's a higher principle at work that makes it all worth it, no matter how tough it is, no matter how tough it seems to be. So, one of the ways that I think about ego death is that we become so moved by these transcendental truths as a result of being a deep experience, that the personal world of the separate self sense including all of the ways it's been culturally conditioned by unenlightened parents and teachers, has been fundamentally dislodged from this from the source of our self sense. In other words, there is this now close to the source of our self sense, there is a vast open space of infinite freedom and unimaginable potential that's always available. That is who and what God actually is. Not what our ego tells us, not what other people's have told us. Not all the terrible things that happen to be true about human life. We discovered there's a deeper truth that transcends anything that happens in time and space. And the more we have surrendered to this deeper dimension of reality, the more that mysterious space will be present within us. That will always ensure our freedom and our liberation, in spite of maybe being given a very difficult deck of cards. In spite of the enormous challenges we're all going to face on a human level, there's something else that's become first and foremost in our attention, in our awareness, and in our experience. So we want to see death of the ego more as when you meet people and you get to know them, especially if you get to know them well, you say, well, are they living for, use mythic language, for some reason I'm falling into that habit lately. I'm not sure why I'm doing it, but anyway. But the thing is, when you get to know people well, you say, well, is this person living first and foremost for God or the absolute? The ultimate mystery that lies beyond life and death. Is that what they're living for? And is that what they're living from? Or are they trapped in the story of the small self, trapped in our collective story? Or is some part of their persona and heart fundamentally liberated and vibrating with a deeper conviction about what's true? So the death of the ego, or the reduction of its influence on our being, can be seen if it depends on you. You know, you can only see and understand as much as you can have experienced yourself. But if your soul has been, if a hole has been punctured in your soul, and that hole is to God of the absolute, you're going to know it, and so will everyone else. Doesn't mean your ego's gone. Doesn't mean it's not going to continue to make great problems for you either, and other people also. The ego doesn't let go very easily, as we all know. I used to call the ego the irrational refusal, the irrational refusnik. It's the part of us that says, no, I won't. Even though we know we should. We know we should, but we say, I won't. You say, well, what's the matter? Why not? You say, because I don't want to. Why? Because I don't. So the ego, from the perspective of enlightened awareness, can be seen as the irrational refusnik or the irrational no. And so it's getting you, getting me or you, whoever you are, whoever I am, to say yes in spite of that. And that's a very difficult thing to do. In spite of the no of the ego, remaining in the unconditional yes. And that's what I call ego death. And everything that I'm describing to you can be done. It's not out of most people's reach, even though most people don't do it. Because it's just more than most people want. Most people don't want to go that deep. So I just want to end saying that enlightenment is real, that it exists, that it's attainable. Please don't doubt it, and also that the most important thing, if you're sincere and serious about this, is not that the ego is eradicated completely, totally, and unconditionally, because that's probably not going to happen. And the most important, it doesn't need to happen, but the ego has to bow down. It has to be willing to become the second fiddle in the story of your life. Not my life, your life. But yeah, there was one more thing I wanted to mention, which I will, which is for our pride. There's positive pride and negative pride. Positive pride is self-respect. It's all good. But the negative pride is the part of your ego, the ego, our ego, that would rather die than bow down. And that's the biggest obstacle to the awakening to enlightened awareness, is the vicious pride that we feel as this ferocious reluctance to bow down, to give in, to say, not my will, but thy will be done. So it's the irrational refusal to bow down, become second fiddle. It's the most difficult expression of ego for those who are most serious about this. It's pride. So be aware of pride. Be very aware of your pride. Positive pride is good, it's self-respect. The pride of the ego, the arrogant pride, is very dangerous, can be a big problem. But nothing that I have spoken about so far is unattainable. It's all within your grasp, if you want it badly enough.